Beerus was already on his knees before anyone understood what was happening. Not kneeling, on his knees, the way a structure goes to its knees when the foundation beneath it has been removed, arms at his sides, the staff that had been an extension of his identity for longer than most civilizations had existed lying somewhere behind him on the ground, and the person standing in front of him was not a god, not a demon, not anything the divine hierarchy had a category for. He was Goku. And he was done being patient. Everything you thought you knew about where Goku's story ends is wrong, and this video is going to show you exactly why, moment by moment. From the decision that started it to the outcome nobody in any universe was prepared for. Subscribe right now and hit the notification bell because this is the version of Goku's story that the gods of destruction spent 11 universes hopping nobody would ever tell. There is a specific kind of breaking that has nothing to do with losing a fight, and people who have only ever watched Goku through the lens of battle power tend to miss it entirely, because it does not happen in a moment of physical defeat. It happens in a moment of clarity, the specific terrible clarity that arrives when a person finally sees the full shape of a system they have been operating inside of and understands, without the comfort of ambiguity, that the system was never designed with their well-being, or the well-being of the people they love anywhere in its architecture. Goku had been given reasons his whole life to trust upward, to trust Kami, to trust King Kai, to trust Whis, to trust the structure of divine authority that arranged itself above the mortal plane in tiers of increasing power and decreasing accountability. He had not followed these figures because he was naive, though the gods who underestimated him consistently made that mistake. He followed them because his instincts, which had almost never been wrong about people, told him that the individuals within the system were mostly acting in good faith, and he had always been better at reading people than at reading institutions, which is a distinction that matters enormously and that nobody ever taught him to make. The tournament of power had cracked something in that trust without fully breaking it. The casual willingness of the Xenos to erase entire universes as the stakes of an entertainment event. The way the Grand Priest managed the proceedings with the smooth, institutional comfort of someone who had long ago made peace with the mathematics of acceptable laws. Goku had felt something shift in him during those events that he had not examined carefully, because examining it would have required sitting still with it. And sitting still with uncomfortable things was the one discipline his training had never fully developed. Then Universe 7 was threatened again, not by an external enemy, not by a villain with a comprehensible motivation that could be addressed through combat, by a divine administrative decision, the kind of decision that gets made in rooms Goku was never invited into, by beings who had decided that the seventh universe's continued existence had become a variable in a calculation that came out more cleanly without it. The reasoning was provided to Whis, who delivered it to Beerus, who said nothing to anyone because there was a hierarchy and the hierarchy had spoken, and that was the beginning and end of his available responses. Goku found out the way he always found out about things that the divine structure preferred he not know, through someone who cared enough about him to break the rule that said not to tell him. He sat with it for one full day. That was the detail that nobody who knew him expected, not rage, not immediate action, not the forward momentum that had characterized every previous response to every previous threat. He sat with it for one full day in the yard outside his house, and Kai brought him food twice, and he did not eat either time. And the specific quality of his stillness during those hours was something she had never seen on him before and recognized immediately as the stillness of a man whose framework for the world was being rebuilt from the ground up, because the previous version had been shown to be insufficient. The unexpected small observation. At some point during that day, a sparrow landed on the ground 3 feet from where he was sitting, and he watched it for a long time, and the sparrow stayed longer than sparrows usually stay near people, as though something in the quality of his stillness read to its small nervous system, not as threat, but as something that existed in that moment, completely outside the category of threat entirely. When he stood up the next morning, something had resolved in him that was not anger and was not grief, and was not the clean, focused determination of a fighter preparing for a known opponent. It was something older than all of those things and quieter, the decision of a person who has finished asking questions about a situation and has moved into the part where questions are no longer the relevant tool. He went to find Whis, not to ask for help, not to seek guidance or training or the kind of measured counsel that Whis had always provided, with the gentle authority of someone who believed that the right information delivered at the right time was the most powerful intervention available. He went to tell Whis something, one specific thing, in the tone of a person who is not requesting permission or seeking agreement, but simply ensuring that the relevant party is not operating under a misapprehension about what is about to happen. He told Whis that he was going to fix it. Whis understood, with the full comprehension of someone who had watched this man push past every limit that the divine hierarchy had quietly assumed would contain him, exactly what fix it meant, and what it would require, and what it would cost. And the expression on his face in that moment was not alarm, and was not disapproval, and was not the careful institutional neutrality of an angel managing a difficult asset. It was something that Whis, in thousands of years of service to the divine structure, had never expected to feel standing in front of a mortal. It was the specific grief of someone who has just understood that the thing they were watching begin cannot be stopped, and that part of them, the part that exists below duty and hierarchy and 10,000 years of trained perspective, does not want to stop it. The transformation did not happen the way the previous ones had happened, and this matters because every threshold Goku had ever crossed before announced itself. Super Saiyan arrived with golden light, and a scream that came from somewhere below the lungs. Super Saiyan Blue carried the specific cold pressure of divine Kai compressing itself into a mortal frame. Ultra Instinct came with silver, and a stillness that felt like the world pausing to take a breath before something irreversible happened. Each one was a signal, a declaration, the body communicating outward that something internal had changed. This was the opposite of that. The change that moved through him in the weeks after the decision was inward only, a restructuring that had no visible component and produced no aura, and generated none of the Kai pressure that his body had always used to externalize its internal states. Whis observed it from a careful distance and described it later, to the only person he trusted with the description, as watching a river change course, not dramatically, not with the violence of flooding, but with the patient geological certainty of water finding a path that the landscape had always contained, but that nothing had yet moved through. The potential had always been there. The circumstances had finally provided the direction. What Goku was developing was not a new form in the sense that the previous transformations were forms. It was not an elevation of the existing power structure, not another tier added to a hierarchy that the divine system had at least theoretically designed to have a ceiling. It was something orthogonal to that structure entirely, a development that the hierarchy had not accounted for because the hierarchy had been built on the assumption that power and authority were aligned, that the beings with the most power were the beings with the mandate to use it, and that the architecture of divine order therefore self-reinforced. The strongest things were also the things the system sanctioned, which meant that more power meant more investment in the system that legitimized it. Goku had always been the exception to that logic without anyone fully registering that he was. His power had never been in service of any structure, not Earth's, not the Z fighters, not the divine hierarchies. It had always been in service of a simpler and more personal ethic that he had never been able to fully articulate, but that governed every significant decision he had ever made, which was roughly that the people in front of him mattered, and the system behind him was secondary to that, and would remain secondary to that regardless of what the system had to say about the arrangement. The God Killer Kai, And that was what Whis eventually called it. Not as a designation he was comfortable with, but as the most accurate description of what the sensors were showing. Kai that resonated at a frequency specifically misaligned with divine energy, in the way that two sounds at almost the same pitch create interference rather than harmony. Developed not from rage or grief, or the sustained emotional peak that previous transformations had required, but from the sustained clarity of a person who had finished grieving a thing and moved into the part where you act on what the grief showed you. It felt from the inside, like Goku described it to Vegeta in the only conversation he had about it before things escalated beyond the point where conversations were the primary mode of communication. Like having been slightly out of alignment his whole life, the way a door hangs slightly crooked in a frame, and you stop noticing it because you have been living with it for so long. And then one day someone fixes it, and you realize in the moment of the fixing how much friction the crookedness had been generating all along, how much energy was being spent on maintaining position against a resistance that was always there and is now simply gone. Vegeta listened to this and said nothing for a long time, and then said that the thing Goku was describing sounded less like a transformation and more like a decision that had finished being made, which was either the most insightful thing Vegeta had ever said about Goku or the most frightening, and it was probably both. And Vegeta's face in the moment after he said it carried the specific expression of a man who has just heard himself say something true that he wishes were not true. Because the implications of it being true were not implications he had fully prepared for. The small detail that exists outside of every account of this period. During one of the training sessions where Whis was attempting to measure and understand what was developing, a session where Goku was throwing Kai blasts at calibrated targets designed to register force and frequency. One of the targets simply ceased to exist when the blast contacted it. Not destroyed in the way Kai destroys things, but gone in the way things go when the energy that underpins their existence is interrupted at a fundamental level. And Whis stood very still looking at the space where the target had been. And Goku looked at the same space, and neither of them said anything. And the silence between them had the specific quality of two people who have just seen the same thing, and are each waiting to find out how the other one is going to decide to understand it. Whis wrote something in the record he was keeping. He did not show Goku what he wrote. But later, when the record was found, what he had written in that space was not a technical assessment, and not a power measurement, and not any of the clinical language that filled the rest of the document. What he wrote was, "He is ready, and I do not know if that is the best thing that has ever happened or the worst. And I have been in service to the divine order for long enough that I should be able to answer that question without hesitation. And the fact that I cannot is itself the most significant data point this record contains." The first god who felt it was Sidra, god of destruction of Universe 9, and he felt it not as an attack and not as a challenge, but as a presence. The specific awareness that something had entered the divine frequency in a way that did not belong there. The way a musician feels a wrong note not as something they analyzed, but as something that landed in their chest before their brain had time to process it. He brought it to Ro, his supreme Kai, and Ro brought it to the Grand Priest through the proper channels. And the Grand Priest listened to the report with the measured stillness of someone who had already received 3 identical reports from 3 other universes, and was in the process of deciding what the appropriate institutional response was. Which was a process that was taking longer than it should have because the appropriate institutional response required first accepting a premise that the institution had never designed a response for. The premise was that the divine order had a problem it could not solve by elevating someone within the divine order to solve it. Every previous threat to the structure had been addressable this way. Find the strongest available sanctioned power, direct it toward the unsanctioned thing, resolve the situation, and restore the hierarchy. The system was self-healing in this sense, capable of producing whatever force was required to maintain its own integrity, and it had been doing so successfully across more cycles of universal history than any mortal civilization had lasted long enough to count. The Grand Priest's composure, which had remained intact through events that had shattered lesser beings, was built on the deep structural confidence of someone who administered a system that had never encountered a situation it could not ultimately absorb. What Goku had become could not be absorbed. Not because the power was too large. The divine order had encountered larger power and incorporated it, had taken the outputs of beings that bent physics and made them administrators, had a long and largely successful history of converting threats into assets. The problem was not scale, it was orientation. God Killer Kai was not simply powerful in the way that Divine Kai was powerful. It was specifically and structurally incompatible with divine energy in a way that meant proximity between the two did not produce a contest between greater and lesser force, but rather a fundamental interference. The divine frequency destabilizing wherever the God Killer frequency was present. The way certain chemicals do not react by producing a larger version of either component, but by producing something different from both of them that neither component can control. Beerus felt it before Goku arrived in Universe 7's divine space, felt it as a wrongness in the Kai he had been breathing for millennia. A note entering the atmosphere that made his teeth sensitive in a way he had no previous experience of. And he stood in his temple, trying to locate the source with the focused attention of a predator that has just detected something it cannot immediately categorize. Which for Beerus was an experience so rare that his body did not have a practiced response to it, and was improvising in real time. He called for Whis. Whis arrived with the specific quality of unhurried movement that meant he had been expecting the call, and had been deciding, on the way, exactly how much of what he knew he was going to share, and in what order, because information delivered at the wrong moment in the wrong sequence could change outcomes in ways that could not be undone. And Whis had always understood that the management of information was its own form of power, and one that he had been exercising, quietly and without announcement. Since the moment he understood what Goku was becoming. What he told Beerus was partial. True but partial, which was the most careful kind of telling, the kind that leaves the recipient with an accurate picture of the immediate situation, while not yet loading them with the full weight of the longer view. Because the full weight of the longer view was something that Beerus, for all his power, was not yet in a position to carry productively. He told him that Son Goku was coming, that the Kai preceding him was new and should not be engaged directly until its properties were better understood, that the appropriate initial response was observation rather than confrontation. Beerus looked at him for a long time after this with the expression of a being who is receiving advice that runs against every instinct, and who is trying to determine whether the instincts or the advice deserve more weight. The unexpected detail that lodges somewhere uncomfortable, on the table in Beerus's temple, a bowl of the pudding that he had most recently declared his favorite sat untouched, the surface of it perfectly still, and it had been sitting there for 6 hours because Beerus had lost his appetite sometime around the moment. The wrongness entered the atmosphere, and the bowl just sat there in the silence of the temple, being an ordinary thing in the middle of something that was not ordinary at all. And somehow the sight of it, the pudding, the normalcy of it, the specific domesticity of a god of destruction with an untouched dessert, made the weight of what was coming feel more real than any power reading could have. Goku landed at the edge of the divine space with the quiet arrival that his new state seemed to naturally produce. No aura, no pressure wave, no announcement, just presence, filling the space the way something fills a space when it belongs there completely and has stopped needing to announce its belonging. He looked at the temple. He looked at the sky above it, the divine light that had always carried a specific quality he had noticed but never examined. And he noticed that in his current state he could see what the light was made of in a way he never had before, could see the frequency of it, the structure, the way it was maintained rather than natural, constructed and sustained by an intention rather than simply existing. He had never seen it that way before. He filed that away and walked forward. Beerus met him at the entrance to the temple rather than inside it, which was a choice that communicated something neither of them needed to name. That inside the temple was Beerus's ground in a way that the entrance was not, and that Beerus had decided, in the half-second between deciding to follow Whis' advice and arriving at the door, that he was not willing to have this conversation from a position that implied the other party had been invited in. It was a small territorial decision, and a very Beerus decision, the instinct of a being whose entire identity was organized around the maintenance of a dominance he had never previously had genuine reason to question, making the only adjustment available to it when the ground shifted. Goku looked at him the way he had been looking at everything since the change completed, not with the combat assessment that his eyes had always run automatically in the presence of powerful beings, cataloging Kai's signatures and physical indicators, and the 1,000 small pieces of information that a fighter collects before a fight begins, but with something quieter and more direct than that. Something that saw Beerus not as an opponent or an authority, or even as the specific complicated figure he had always been in Goku's life, the being who had arrived and threatened everything and become, over years of strange proximity, something that did not have a clean word but that occupied a real space. Something that saw him, simply, as a person who was about to have a hard conversation. Goku spoke first. This surprised Beerus, who had prepared an opening, had in fact been composing his approach since Whis' report, building the architecture of a position that established the hierarchy without provoking an immediate escalation, and Goku speaking first dissolved that architecture before it could be deployed. What Goku said was not a declaration of war. It was not a challenge, not an ultimatum, not the language of a being arriving to dismantle something. He said, and this is the part that the accounts of this moment consistently fail to capture with sufficient precision. He said that he understood why the system worked the way it worked, and that he was not there because he thought the people inside it were evil, and that Beerus specifically was someone he had genuinely come to something like respect across the years of knowing him. Complicated and incomplete, and full of the awkwardness of two beings who had met as enemies, and never fully renegotiated the terms. He said all of that first, because it was true, and because starting with what was true was the only way he knew how to begin things that mattered. Then he said that none of it changed what he was there to do. The argument that followed lasted longer than most divine conflicts lasted, and it was an argument in the genuine sense, not a euphemism for a fight, not the posturing that precedes combat, but an actual exchange in which both parties were present and both parties were listening, and both parties were trying, with the tools available to them, to reach the other person across a distance that was not physical and could not be closed by physical means. Beerus was not stupid and had never been stupid, and the case he made for the divine order was not the weak case of someone defending the indefensible out of self-interest. It was the real case, the case that had genuine weight, the argument that order requires authority and authority requires hierarchy and hierarchy, requires that the beings at the top of it have the power to maintain it or the whole structure collapses, and what replaces it is not freedom but chaos. The chaos of a universe with no organizing principle, which historically produced more suffering than any divine administrative decision ever had. Goku listened to all of it, every part. He did not interrupt, did not pace, did not show the physical impatience that had always been one of his most consistent tells in conversations that were not going the direction he wanted. He stood still and he listened, and when Beerus finished, he was quiet for a moment in the way he had been quiet in his yard the day after learning what the divine order had decided about Universe 7. The specific stillness of someone sitting with the full weight of what they just heard rather than preparing a response, while the other person is still talking. Then he said that Beerus was right, that the case he made was a real case and not a dishonest one, and that the order Beerus was describing had genuine value and had protected genuinely real things across a genuinely real span of time. And then he said that it had also decided that his home and everyone in it were acceptable losses in an administrative calculation, and that the people who made that decision had the power to make it and the authority to make it, and that those two things together did not make it right, and that he had spent his whole life believing that stronger meant the responsibility to protect, not the prerogative to discard, and that he was not willing to live in a system that treated those two things as interchangeable. The silence after this had a texture that Beerus had never felt in a silence before, and the specific quality of it was this. It was the silence of an argument that had been completed, not won by either side, not resolved, but completed. Both positions stated fully and honestly, and heard fully and honestly. And the silence was what existed in the space after that kind of completion, when there is nothing left to say, and the only remaining question is what happens next. The small human detail that lives in this moment, Beerus's hands, which had been at his sides throughout the entire exchange, with the controlled stillness of someone managing their physical responses very carefully, closed slightly during the last thing Goku said, the fingers curling inward by perhaps a centimeter, the involuntary physical echo of something internal tightening, and then slowly, over the next several seconds, they opened again. And by the time the silence had settled, they were flat at his sides once more. And whether that opening was release or resignation or something that did not have a name yet was not something that Beerus's face was going to clarify. He stepped aside from the entrance to the temple, not in surrender, not in agreement, in the specific gesture of someone who has recognized that the conversation has reached the boundary of what words can do, and that what comes next is going to happen regardless, and who has made the choice, in the half-second available for choices, to not be the thing that initiates what comes next. Goku walked past him into the divine space, and the argument was over. The Grand Priest received him in the space between universes, which was not a location in any conventional sense, but a condition. The place that existed in the architecture of the multiverse, the way a hinge exists in a door. Not the door and not the wall, but the thing that connected them and made the relationship between them functional. And the Grand Priest standing in it had the quality of something that belonged there completely, that had been part of its structure for so long that removing him would have changed the space itself, rather than simply emptying it. He did not look surprised. The Grand Priest had not looked surprised by anything in longer than surprise had been a relevant category for him, and he received Goku's arrival with the serene administrative composure of someone who had known this moment was approaching for some time, and had spent that time not preparing to prevent it, but preparing to understand it, which was a distinction that said something significant about what the Grand Priest actually was underneath the role. Though what exactly it said was something Goku was still processing even as he stood in front of him. What passed between them was not a fight in the sense that any previous conflict in Goku's life had been a fight. The God Killer Kai and the Grand Priest's energy met in the space between them and produced the interference that Whis had described, the frequencies working against each other in a way that had physical consequences for the space around them. Reality, in their immediate vicinity, becoming unstable in the specific way, it becomes unstable when the forces maintaining it are in direct contradiction. The visual texture of the air between them going uncertain, the edges of things losing their confidence. The Grand Priest did not escalate. This was the thing that landed differently than anything Goku had prepared for. He engaged. He responded. He was fully present in the exchange and brought to it everything that a being of his nature and his position possessed. But he did not push toward conclusion, did not try to end it, moved through it with the patience of someone who understood that this was not a conflict to be won but a process to be witnessed, which was either wisdom or something that looked like wisdom from the outside and was actually something more complicated, and Goku could not fully determine which while he was inside the exchange. At the point where the interference between their energies reached its peak, The point where the space around them had gone so uncertain that the universes visible in the distance were flickering at their edges, where the hinge that the Grand Priest embodied was straining under the contradiction of what was pressing against it from both sides. The Grand Priest stopped. Not defeated, not overpowered in the clean sense of a being that has been pushed past what it can sustain. He stopped with the specific deliberateness of a choice. The way you stop doing something when you have decided that continuing it is no longer the right response to what is happening. And the stopping produced a silence that was different from the silence of an ending and different from the silence of a pause. A third kind of silence that Goku did not have a name for and stood inside of trying to understand. The Grand Priest looked at him fully, without the institutional layer that usually existed between his gaze and whatever it was directed at, and said that the Order had made an error, that the decision regarding Universe 7 had been reviewed in light of circumstances that the original decision had not accounted for, and that the review had produced a different outcome, and that the universe was not going to be erased. He said it in the tone of someone delivering a correction rather than a concession, which was a distinction that mattered to the Grand Priest, and that Goku decided in the moment to accept at face value rather than contest, because contesting the framing would have required caring about the framing more than the outcome, and he had never been someone who cared about framing more than outcome. Universe 7 was safe. Goku stood in the space between universes with that fact settling into him, and what it produced was not triumph and not relief in the simple sense, but something more layered than either of those. The specific complicated feeling of having done something that needed doing, and having paid a price for it that he could not yet fully calculate, because the price was not in damage or loss, but in the permanent alteration of his relationship to a structure he had lived inside of his entire life. And that alteration did not have clean edges yet, did not resolve into a simple new understanding of where he stood and what he was, but sat in him open and unfinished the way real changes sit before the life that contains them has had time to grow around them. The small observation that belongs to this moment. On the way back, passing through the divine space of Universe 7, he looked up at the sky that Beerus and Whis maintained, and noticed that it was the same sky it had always been, unchanged, going about the business of being a sky with complete indifference to everything that had just happened. And something about that, the sky's indifference, its simple persistence in being exactly what it was, settled something in him that the conversation and the conflict and the outcome had not settled, quieted a frequency that had been running loud since the morning he stood up from his yard and decided what needed to happen. He went home. Kai was in the kitchen. Gohan was visiting with Pan, who was at the age where everything required running toward rather than walking, and the sound of her feet on the floor of the house reached him before he was fully through the door, and he stood in the doorway for a moment, just taking in the specific ordinary texture of it. The noise and the warmth and the complete unconcerned normalcy of a family that did not yet know what had happened and would need to be told, and would have responses that he was going to have to be present for in all their complexity. He was not done. Whatever he had started was not finished, because the error the Grand Priest had corrected was one error in a system that had a long history of errors, and he knew that now in a way he could not unknow, and the knowing was going to require something of him going forward that he had not yet determined the shape of. But Pan ran into the doorway and grabbed his leg and looked up at him with the specific unreserved happiness of a child who has not yet learned to moderate their enthusiasm for the people they love. And he reached down and picked her up, and the weight of her was the most real thing he had felt all day. The gods could wait. For now, this was enough. And the question of what came next for him, for the Order, for the space between what the divine structure was and what it needed to become, hung in the air above a completely ordinary house on a completely ordinary afternoon, like weather that had not yet decided what it was going to be. It was still forming,